So today we're going to start talking about poetry. Now poetry actually makes up a major part of the Old Testament. Not just in Psalms, of course, the Psalms makes a big part of the Old Testament, but also in prophecy and in wisdom literature. So poetry really is a big genre within the Old Testament. And because of that, it also has a major influence in the New Testament. In fact, a lot of John's writing, you can see a very poetic feel to it, as well as even Jesus' teaching, which, in fact, as we go through poetry in the Old Testament, we're going to see how we're going to use some of Jesus' teaching as an example. So poetry really has a major presence in the Bible. So, let's take a look at the genre. How does the author communicate in poetry, or what is distinct about poetry? Now, at the very core, at its very essence, poetry is art. And I think these are the elements that really make poetry distinct from other genres. First thing is vivid descriptions. In English, we'll pick up a narrative, whatever. If you're reading Twilight or Jurassic Park, whatever, you pick it up and you're expecting to read a lot of vivid descriptions that you can imagine in your mind. Now, in Hebrew narratives, that's not true. In fact, you won't see a description of a person or their appearance or their physical features unless it somehow plays an important role in understanding the story or how the story develops. So even though in English we're seeing vivid descriptions everywhere, in biblical literature, really, it's limited to poetry. You don't see a lot of vivid descriptions outside of poetry. And so in that sense, poetry has that unique artistic element of vivid descriptions. The other thing is, poetry evokes emotion. The author chooses poetry when he wants to really grab you and make you feel what he feels, whether it's joy, he wants you to sing to the Lord, or it's a state of depression, he wants you to know what he is feeling. In that sense, it's also unique because you don't really see that a lot. A lot of times in history, they're just trying to tell you why things are the way they are and convince you of not doing one thing or the other. But in poetry, they're really trying to get you to feel what they're feeling. The third, what I think is unique to poetry, is that it's intended to just be pretty. The way the words are used are meant to be aesthetically pleasing, which is unique to poetry. When you read a story that's Hebrew, sure, you can appreciate to some extent the language, but in poetry it is an emphasis. The author is really taking a lot of care and a lot of time to make sure that the wording, the language, is in itself just a beautiful element or artistic element in poetry. So those are some of the distinctives of poetry. Now, I want you to think about poetry from a perspective of why somebody would write it. I could choose to just tell my wife, I love you. That could be really easy. Or, if you're single and you're trying to impress this lady friend of yours, you could just tell her you love her. And that may have a great impact. But if you really want to go all out, you could write a poem. Now, a poem might not say anything more than just, I love you. You could write, 200-word poem, and it's really boiled down to how much you love your girlfriend or your wife. The message itself is a very simple, maybe something that can be boiled down into one sentence. The unique thing about poetry is that it emphasizes not the message, but the way the message is expressed. So you're not just telling your lover, it's how you say it that's important. Because how you say it is going to evoke emotion. It's going to draw your audience into responding the way you want them to. So poetry is unique in that there is a major emphasis not just on the message, but really on how the message is expressed. Now that's that's unique to poetry because even though how the author communicates is important in all genres, it's not in itself what the author is focused on. And in poetry, it really is. The author wants you to see his language. He wants you to see the artistic elements within poetry, and for you to appreciate them. So a lot of poetry is really appreciating its artistic side. I'm going to use one illustration to really communicate this. Imagine listening to a song and hearing it and knowing its message. Now, if you don't appreciate the music for the music itself, then you've missed out on a major element of the song. In fact, you've probably missed out on the most important aspect of that song, even though you've heard its message. And I think to some degree that's true of poetry. Yes, okay, you read Psalm 1 and you get the idea of it, but you've got to let it grab you. You've got to let it evoke your emotion. You've got to see the descriptions. You've got to appreciate its aesthetic, the language, and how pretty it is. So poetry in that sense is really important. Good. Couple more notes. How do we read poetry in Hebrew? To be honest, let's comparing it to English. Like, for example, in English, when we hear poetry in English, we think of things like rhyme and similes and metaphors, and really we put a major emphasis on sound in English. Now, to some extent, Hebrew also has a lot of phonetic elements. There's a lot of artistic elements as far as sound goes in Hebrew poetry. But unfortunately, because we're not reading in Hebrew, we're going to miss out on a lot of those elements. In fact, we're going to miss out on all of them because we can't hear the Hebrew or appreciate it. The good thing is that in Hebrew, that's not the most important aspect of poetry. In fact, probably the most important aspect of Hebrew poetry is something called parallelism. Now, I'm just going to give you a quick definition here, and then we'll skip it for now, because the rest of the entire lecture on poetry is going to be on parallelism. But parallelism is essentially you've got these various lines of poetry, and it's how these different lines relate to each other and how they refine each other. That's really poetry in Hebrew. So it's not so much about sound as much as it is ideas, which is great because in English we can see parallelisms. So even though we miss out on a lot of the sound elements or phonetic elements of the Hebrew poet, we pick up on the most important, which is parallelism. Before we really get into in-depth description of poetry and parallelisms, I want to throw out a quick word about words in poetry, and that is words in poetry are used very creatively. There's a lot of word plays, and the author really nuances his language. And so because the author is using words in this way, word studies become really important in poetry. You really have to get to know the language. We talked about word studies in when we got to letters. Well, this is really when you're really going to get to use word studies, is in poetry, because there's a lot of double meanings and word plays in poetry. And so you're going to have to break out with your lexicons to really appreciate that artistic element of poetry. In the next video, I'm going to really describe what parallelisms are and really go how to appreciate that parallelism within Hebrew poetry.